Hi, I'm Janne, and I'll be talking about studies of the Danish web using Netarkivet. I'll mention some of the projects that have used materials from the Danish National Web Archive Netarkivet, but since the focus in Working Group 1 is on entire web domains, I'll mostly talk about the study that Nielsen and I have been doing called Probing a Nation's Web Domain. I'll show some examples of the analysis we're doing as an example of how one can study a national web domain. Also briefly mention some methodological aspects and some of the challenges and possibilities of doing transnational research. Several studies have been done using materials from Netarkivet, and here are some examples. As you can see, some of them focus on Danish cases, while others have a more international scope. Some have a relatively broad scope, studying a topic across the Danish web domain, but most focus on specific sectors of types of websites. I expect that these projects have been done using the Open Wayback and maybe also the full text search offered by the archive, even though I don't know for sure. But I also want to mention another type of project with access to materials from Netarkivet, the large-scale projects using the supercomputer at the Royal Danish Library, the Dijk National Cultural Heritage Cluster. This is a supercomputer that allows for processing of large amounts of material from the cultural heritage collections at the library, and research projects can apply to be a pilot project on the cluster, and in case it's granted, one gets access to runtime and IT developer support. And here are some of the pilot projects which use materials from Netarkivet, and I wanted to mention the top one in particular, the Deep Anon, because the idea of trying to anonymize large datasets of web material are probably interesting to some of you, because anonymization might be one of the ways that can make it possible to share archived web datasets. So the project that I want to mostly speak about is the project Probing a Nation's Web Domain that Nielsen and I have been working on with support from Ulrik, from Per and Asger at the Royal Danish Library, and Kenneth from the Center for Humanities Computing, Aarhus. A lot of you have probably heard at least one of us talk about this project, but I hope you'll bear with me. So in this project, we want to study the history of the Danish web by doing what we call probing. That is a sort of exploratory digging, trying to find different ways of studying the web domain, which together can give us a sense of the entire Danish web and its development. The main research question is very broad. How has the Danish web developed from 2006 to 2015? But along the way, our findings lead to new, more specific questions as we find patterns and try to understand outliers or similar. So it's an ongoing process of mapping different characteristics and trying to interpret our findings. The project consists of several parts, and we've been fortunate to be granted 3 pilot projects at the Cultural Heritage Cluster. To study the development of the entire Danish web domain in 10 years, we create a corpus from each year. In my next presentation, I'll say a bit more about the corpus creation, but basically the idea is to create a sort of snapshot from each year. We then do different analysis using different data from the archive and focusing on different aspects of the web domain. The next slides will be examples of some of the results from these different analyses. And I won't talk about the actual results or the interpretations, but just show you some figures that will hopefully give you an idea of the types of findings. I also want to mention that this way of mapping the domain is something we hope will allow for comparisons between web domains, but that it will of course require addressing the way the archives of the different countries might be different and how that will influence the results. So the first data source we use are the crawl logs, and we use metadata to look for different ways of measuring the web. So we look at the number and size of objects, and we look at number of domains. We look also at the distribution of objects. So here you see the very long tail of web data and the distribution of objects per domain. Another thing we look at are different top levels domain and how objects are distributed there. And we look at different file types. How does that develop? Another part of the project looks at text. So this is all the body text out of HTML documents with all punctuation, etc. removed. So it's basically a big bag of words. And we use that to look at, for instance, languages on the Danish web, word frequencies, and we've also been trying to look at some topics over time. Another part of the project looks at links. So we look at, for instance, ingoing links to top-level domains from .dk. We look at how the Danish web linked to other country code top-level domains. And we look at how the link structure to social media looks. How does links to social media develop over time? The last type that I will mention is our studies of source code. And one of the things we're interested in when looking at the source code is finding traces of trackers. So here we see an extract from an analysis of the tracking technology called web beacons and the top domains setting these beacons. The colored ones are Google and Facebook domains. So we can also map the development over time for specific tracking companies and explore different patterns or look at outliers. And here we see Facebook. We can also search for scripts from specific companies and see the increase of, for instance, Facebook and Google scripts on the Danish web. We also try to map the development of e-commerce on the Danish web using the source code, and we're trying to explore other ways of what we can find while digging through the source code. The next steps of the project will be trying to look at other types of sources, pictures for instance. It could be audio and video, it could be looking into geotagging, web design, and other things. And we're also working on combining the analysis to try to look across the different types of results or findings to see how we can, the findings from one part can help interpret findings from another. So I also want to mention some methodological aspects related to our studies. When we work with materials in web archives, we have to handle issues of both abundance and scarcity, as we all know, with multiple versions of the same objects, but also lots of things missing. An important takeaway from having worked both qualitatively and quantitatively with the web archive and having used the different interfaces made available as access points to the archive is that it's important to understand the implications of the ways the materials are available through the different interfaces. So there are different implications of the same methodological challenges depending on whether you access the materials in one way or another in our experience. Some issues are very easy to pinpoint in some interfaces but become invisible in others. And some interfaces allow for some types of selection and analysis while others do not. So for instance, if you want to do studies like ours, it's necessary that the interface allows you a consistent way of creating corpora so that numbers can be compared over time. In our experience, we need to constantly critically assess the quality of the data and the possible bias in the data in order to interpret the results. And to do this, we need collaborations between researchers, curators, and IT developers in order to understand whether changes we observe are actual historical changes of the web or are caused by changes in the archive. And here we're very fortunate with the great collaborations we have with Netarkivet. So I want to end by saying a bit about the possibilities and challenges of transnational research as I see it and based on some of our experience with Netarkivet. And we're lucky that the agreements that are in place now seem to allow for cooperation between Danish researchers and international researchers using the materials in Netarkivet, and that is of course a great opportunity, but there's also some boundaries to how that can be done. And when we look across the different archives, we all know that we have different legal frameworks and there's different scopes for different archives. And so that's of course a challenge of actual transnational research. So even though it's useful that many archives use the same harvesting software, maybe it's in different versions, probably different settings. So that can be a challenge to figure out how is it actually comparable across different web archives. And I think a part of the way forward is to agree on some standards, for instance, standards for how to create corpora and the formats used. It can also be talking about if we can do joint development of scripts for analysis that will then easier allow for comparisons. And of course, there can be questions of access to data, access to infrastructure, analytics, software, etc. And I think it's interesting to think about whether we want to try to compile data to study data together or whether we need to instead do our analysis in our different archives and then find ways of comparing results across domains. So I hope we'll talk more about that in these days. Thanks.